For the last month and a half, I've been very slowly been chipping my way at Final Fantasy 16. It's taking a while, alright? In my defense though, the guy who's keeping me locked up in his basement only really lets me out for like half an hour a day, so I'm only able to catch up one cutscene at a time. And for all the things you could potentially criticize about this game, I gotta say, it makes up for most, if not all of it, in pure spectacle. This is hands down one of the craziest games I've ever played in my life. Just when you think they've gone all out and they can't possibly top the insanity factor of the last fight between two titanic elemental beasts, Yoshi P says, "Dragon in space, bitch!" So much of its worth comes in these big moments, and I love that it's able to give me hyper-produced, largely interactable, anime-ass set-piece moments, and consistently ups the ante in regular combat throughout the experience. All in all, it's an absolute behemoth of a video game, and it's awesome. Since Final Fantasy came out, there's only one other game that I've had the time to play front to back: Birth. Birth is, let's say, not as insane as Final Fantasy. It's a quiet, simple, macabre little point-and-click puzzle game that can be beat in 2 hours. It doesn't have a semi-open world, it takes place on a single street. It doesn't have you brawling it out with spell-infused combat, it has you pouring a jar of rocks into a jar of water. It doesn't have you overthrowing powerful leaders and their giant Pokemon, it has you assembling a body because you're lonely. By every description, it's not as exciting, feature-packed, or grand as Final Fantasy is, and yet it's an equally viable piece of art, and both games are some of my favorite experiences of the year. A lot of activities that can be labeled as mundane, uninteresting, unremarkable, even boring in real life are used all the time in game design. Even within large, complicated games, a lot of the elements that are the most difficult to implement are the ones that go completely unnoticed by the player because they're so outwardly simple. But before we discuss simple elements in games that are otherwise huge and intricate, let's dive into the methodology of designing an entire game based off what is considered a mundane activity. Unfortunately, I suffer from donkey brain, so I can only give so much insight on this topic, but the good news is that you're not just stuck with my own conclusions this time. In researching this topic, I got to chat with Madison Karrh, the solo dev behind Birth, as well as Tim Dawson, programmer and co-designer of Unpacking. Two people that actually do this for a living and know what they're talking about, so I'm glad to reveal that for the first time on this channel, the total IQ it took to make this video was more than 7. Before I asked Tim about the design philosophies of Unpacking, I wanted to know what drew the team to this idea. Why had his studio Witchbeam decided to change course so drastically from their last game, Assault Android Cactus, a Robotron-esque arcadey shooter, to Unpacking, a cozy, lo-fi game with no action at all? And he said that actually the change didn't feel all that drastic to them because the philosophy behind both was the same. Take an idea, strip it to its core, and then build it back up. So let's strip down games as a whole real quick. Let's take away all the bells and whistles, all the bosses, the stories, the worlds. What is the essence of our enjoyment? I think one factor at least has to be that they're satisfying. It doesn't matter if it's through cathartic acts of violence, overcoming something that seemed impossible, watching characters go through arcs, building that character to fit your style, growing your arsenal or your team. Sometimes it takes a long time, sometimes you have to work way harder for it, but it's always there in some capacity. We also generally want games to feel natural. We want smooth gameplay, controls that we're not constantly fighting, good pacing, a logical progression of events, menus that don't require a PhD in nuclear physics to understand. This is something that a lot of games actually struggle with, but it's something that nearly everyone would like to see. Most people also want a high level of detail, whether it's graphically or in terms of Easter eggs, secrets, world building, anything. We really just need to see that there's something past the surface. I mean, even Call of Duty will try and allude to stories with their characters and maps. And then, of course, there's escapism, which it doesn't necessarily mean a way to run away from real life like some people pretend it does. Sometimes it's seeing our own lives represented in a unique format or experiencing someone else's story that we can reflect on. Of course, some games are designed to challenge those very concepts and see how a player will react to that fundamental shift, but most games strive for all four in some way. We're gonna get a bit more into that last one soon, but let's first discuss how we can work with these three in as basic a way as possible. Considering we're dealing with interactive media where you influence things on screen through an intermediary, about the simplest way you can make something satisfying is a gameplay loop where you just put things in the right place. I feel like when I say that, most people will immediately think of puzzle games because there's a clear, instantly visible goal, you're given limited tools, and you need to find the correct path or method to get an object to the right place. And anyone who's cracked a puzzle that they were stumped on in Portal or The Pedestrian or The Witness can attest to that being a sometimes simple, always very satisfying process. But even then, you have to try and understand how the physics will work, how to deal with perspective, or how to map yourself out in these increasingly large puzzle canvases. Puzzles can require a lot of effort, not always with the controller, but at least from you. We can definitely go simpler. Organization is incredibly satisfying, everything fitting perfectly as it should with minimal brain crunch involved, and it's especially especially satisfying in games because it can be isolated and there's always an actual space for things to go. In real life, I mean, I put off organizing things as much as possible because I know that sitting in my closet is a sleeping bag, a suitcase, 4 pairs of pants, 8 shirts, a horribly disfigured teddy bear from my childhood, a Twinkie, a fan, and a Wii. None of those things go in the same place, and half the time I don't even know where they could go around my house. Like, one is easy, I'll just eat it, but then I have to run around finding places for the rest, and obviously burn the teddy bear in a bonfire like the demon spawn it is. When I organize my utensils, I could see that some haven't been properly cleaned, and so I toss them in the sink. I might realize that I have too many utensils for the amount of slots I have, and up in the top right corner is the charred bear head I didn't know what to do with, so I gotta go melt that in acid. And then I might want to go clean and place my dishes, but I just added clutter from the utensils. I have to manually scrub everything and clean all the grime from the sink, and I forget that I had a vat of acid in there and burn my hands off. The point is, I hate organizing in real life, but if you can take away all the hot potatoing and ensure definitive spots for everything, as well as take away all the manual labor, all of a sudden I love organizing utensils in a little to the left. I love setting up my closet and unpacking. I love having acid-dipped skeleton hands in Birth. This to me is the simplest form of satisfaction, and I like that I don't need to break my brain or break a controller to get there. It's all accentuated by the visuals and audio too. A lot of warm colors, simple animations, and little sounds that poke out of the quiet music. The rich popping or shuffling sounds of windowsill, the small zooms and clicks of Assemble with Karrh, the soft scratchy art of a little to the left, the quiet ambience of unpacking, the clean, crisp look of Birth, the whiteboard aesthetic of the white door. It just creates a good environment around this style of gameplay. Something that can be a bit difficult in games like this though is giving players enough leeway so that they're never stuck, they never feel like they're doing anything wrong necessarily, but there's still a real solution that you can be proud of in the end. You need to loosen your grip on the player without losing it altogether, and the best way to do that is by having options, or what you could call soft solutions. You could have multiple answers to puzzles depending on what catches your eye, like how for this puzzle you can either arrange the objects by height to make a V shape, or you can complete the pattern at the bottom, or you can have solution parameters that allow for some creativity. Apparently unpacking was initially far more strict in its design than it is now, with there only being one place to put everything, but in playtesting they noticed that some people didn't respond well to only being able to place their plates on one specific shelf instead of having some room to mix things around. So while the final game doesn't just let you put plates anywhere like your bed or your shower, you are able to put them on any shelf in the kitchen as long as you can fit the other dishes in as well. There is one item though that you're forced to put in a bit of an odd place. It's not exactly where you would expect, and it's the only place for it to go. And Tim mentioned that this was because leaving that specific spot for that specific thing was a key part of Unpacking's narrative. We'll go a little bit deeper into that in a bit, but it's worth noting that you can make certain actions or decisions stand out by just having more constraints around them compared to the rest of the game. You can subtly draw attention to something just by challenging the game's existing logic. On the flip side, to make the experience more inviting, this game also initially lets you place anything just about anywhere you want as long as there's space. It only tells you when things are out of place at the end, so you can shuffle it all around to the right locations. And this was done so that the player wouldn't feel judged for messing up and could easily make adjustments later on. You're never wrong, you're just pre-right, which is kind of a nice feeling. It's also one of the things that makes the game feel natural to play. You aren't ever soft-locked, and there's usually existing objects in the rooms you're unpacking in that nudge you to put similar objects in those areas. You got games? Put them next to these other games. Another helpful tool is the auto-rotate function, where it'll recognize that there isn't enough space for an item in the place you're hovering over in one direction, but there is in another direction, and it'll just turn itself on your behalf. Really small feature, one that the team wasn't even sure about at first because it took away from the quote puzzle-solving aspects of the game, but once it was implemented, it was so easy and snappy that they knew they had to keep it. One of Madison's goals with Birth was to create a flow state with the game. She didn't want people getting stuck and checking walkthroughs, so she deprioritized puzzle difficulty and emphasized a detail-oriented experience. Interacting with clocks or hidden objects out on the street view unlocks secret puzzles accompanied with unique visuals. Every mandatory puzzle is also packaged into scene details, so you have to click on a shelf or a table at a coffee shop to access them. And sometimes you're not even solving puzzles at all. You're moving jars out of the way to grab something behind them, or hovering over a row of flowers to see which is holding a special item. You could probably classify Birth under the point-and-click puzzle genre for convenience sake. I mean, that's literally what I did earlier in the video, but it's not necessarily built for puzzle game fanatics. It's built more for people who like to stop and smell the roses from time to time. Not that those are mutually exclusive, but one is more definitively the right demographic. Just like before, you can also challenge these rules to draw more attention to something. What Remains of Edith Finch is a visual novel with small for lack of a better word, mini games that it uses to tell the stories of a bunch of different people in a cursed family. And it's a master at taking something that feels natural at first and then throwing a little bit of a wrench into the mix or having one thing that's missing. It creates a sense of unease, like something has fundamentally gone wrong. My favorite example is at one point it asks you to loop around a certain activity over and over as something else plays on the side, and your motions become more subconscious as your full attention moves to what's playing, which aligns you perfectly with the thought process of the character who's doing a mundane task and starts to lose himself in his daydreams. Windowsill intentionally makes its puzzles a little bit unnatural. Despite taking place in a box, you kind of have to think outside of one, which is great when the game is so short, only lets you interact with a handful of things on screen at once, and is designed to be off-kilter. So while a puzzle where you need to triple click on one object to reveal another one with no indication that that's what you have to do is totally fine for something with the goals this game has, the same puzzle in Birth would be antithetical to its entire premise. If somebody tried to interact with everything in the scene and nothing happened, they might be compelled to check a walkthrough before spamming anything. It's not a bad puzzle until it's put into the wrong game. This kind of idea also wouldn't work in Unpacking either, and not just because the game is also committed to creating as frictionless of a gameplay experience as possible until it tells me to find a place for my bra and I just short circuit. Where does that? I feel like this feels right, doesn't it? But also because Unpacking isn't really a puzzle game. I actually asked Tim how he'd categorize it, even offered up some suggestions as if he needed my help understanding his own creation, but everything I mentioned was defined by gameplay, and his reply was none of them. It's a story game. When you really get down to it, most of life is mundane activities. At least that's how Madison sees it, which is why she's so drawn to slice of life games where you get to step into somebody else's shoes for a bit and rifle around their belongings. And it's why all three of her games have operated in that realm. And as a side note, I would really recommend picking up her other two games on Steam because Landlord of the Woods is $1 and Whimsy is free, so I feel like I don't even really need to convince you at that point. Anyways, one of the reasons details are so important in games like this is because that's almost exclusively their means of telling stories. These games are low or no dialogue, there aren't really characters for you to meet in the traditional sense, and most of the story is filled in by your own intuition. Now to me, that combination is ideal for representing passive emotions like isolation, frustration, longing, comfort, calm. These are really hard to portray in dialogue-heavy, cutscene-heavy, character-heavy games because you usually always need to be progressing. You've set up a more active narrative, so if it stops being active, the player starts to get bored. Ergo, you can't get them to fully relate to or understand the passage of time or a character's lingering emotions. And yes, I did just say ergo, I hate Me Too. Like, did you guys ever watch Doctor Who? Who am I kidding? You're watching a video game video essay. Of course you did. Do you remember when Rory waited in a room for 2,000 years for Amy to show up like he was the original simp? It never really hit just how long that was. I mean, realistically, most of us would lose our minds just sitting there and waiting for a week, much less a month. I mean, 2,000 years? Are you kidding me? But when I was watching it, I was just like, damn, that's a long time. She is kind of hot though, so understandable. Compare that to a game like The Longing, which is all about just kind of hanging around. Like for 400 real life days, you're just figuring out how to pass the time. I mean, it's up to you if you want to do that. In no way is this game for everyone, nor does it even fully fit into some people's definition of what a game is, but it does convey this niche emotion a hell of a lot better. You don't need 400 days to do this though. Even just exploring Birth for 2 hours as an outside observer looking to connect with this new world around you with no other distractions is enough to sit with these more drawn out feelings. Obviously, I feel like more active emotions are better suited for more explicit narratives, you know, anger, excitement, greed, bravery, power. I'm sort of stretching the definition of emotion, but you get what I'm saying. And then some emotions are versatile enough to work in both, ones that can be very concentrated or very drawn out, like love or sadness. Madison mentioned that horror games like Silent Hill were great at hitting both marks, active and passive, and the reasons why I think that is might be grounds for its own video, who knows. I don't have time to get into it here because it'll take forever, but it's something worth thinking about. Games that tackle these outwardly unremarkable ideas are a great way to shed light on the beauty or tragedy that exists in most people's day-to-day lives. I mentioned that Tim views Unpacking as a narrative game, and he thinks the target audience for it is less so people who like to organize things, and instead, much like Birth, is for people who like to rifle through stuff and discover what they mean to other people. Unsurprisingly, this game was inspired by a real-life move for Tim and Ren Breyer, who I didn't get the chance to speak with, but she's the creative director and co-designer of Unpacking, so she deserves a lot of credit for what I've been been talking about here. You can tell this game comes from a real place, cause it had to. I can almost hear the conversations that led to the two mocking this game up. And it's easy to relate to as a player because most of us have unpacked at some point in our lives. In fact, while I was sitting around playing this game, I was doing so one room away from all of my stuff that was sitting there in a suitcase just waiting to be taken out. I told you, I hate organizing in real life, but I also love the visual of putting off unpacking by playing this game. The moment-to-moment gameplay does come down to arranging boxes and rooms, but that's really just a narrative device to get you to look closely at what these boxes contain as the central character moves to new places over the course of her life. Awards, souvenirs, supplies, you can see what hobby she dropped, which one she picked up, you can see her sense of style change, even her coffee machine has character. Every gameplay move is actually secretly a story move. Like, to avoid spoiling anything, the item I mentioned earlier that could only be placed in one unideal spot is meant to make your character feel unaccommodated, and that apartment as a whole was a really tight squeeze where nothing felt like it was your own. And then at a later stage, our character is setting up in a way that makes room for somebody else to join, which feels like a direct response to her last situation. I didn't always pick up on every detail in this game, but sometimes I didn't have to. I mean, I could feel how tightly I had to cram into that one apartment. There were way more constraints in that level than really any other, so either way I got the message. Unpacking is interesting because for a game where all you see is a bunch of objects, it's a more human experience than most. I don't want to act like bigger games can't be inspired by real life events though. For example, you might have heard the story of how Hidetaka Miyazaki developed a summoning system in Souls after his car broke down and a group of people showed up, helped him out, and then disappeared off into the night. But of course, we're not seeing a one-to-one adaptation of that story. This has its own charm. I do want to spend a bit of time here at the end though discussing the small, practically unnoticeable elements of games with much bigger scopes. Elements that seem unassuming, but are actually sometimes the most complicated things to implement in the whole game. What do you think the hardest part of developing The Last of Us 2 was? Was it the Rat King fight, the enemy AI, was it being on the internet after the game came out? Probably, but at least according to the game director and the lead animator, it wasn't any of those things. It was the doors. Apparently doors in games absolutely suck to make. In fact, there's a whole thought experiment by Liz England, former designer at Insomniac, called The Door Problem. It's like a super quick crash course in understanding how complicated, intricate, and multifaceted game design is through the lens of a simple premise. You're making a game and it has doors. Now come all the questions. Can the player open the doors? Can they open all of them? If they can't, how do they know which doors they can open? Are they different colors, blocked by obstacles, maybe don't have doorknobs? Can they be locked? Can enemies use them? Do they close behind enemies? Do they close behind you? Is there a button input to open doors? Do they open automatically? Do you have to walk into them? What if there are two players? Can they be on either side of the door? If they can, how do you load everything on both sides? If you can't, how do you make sure they don't? Does the other player teleport to the door with you? Do you both have to be at the door for it to work? Are there keys? If a door opens in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Basically, a lot of thought goes into doors, and everyone from the creative director to the animators to the programmers to the sound and UI designers have a hand in it. Apparently a lot of AAA games actively avoid them whenever possible. Like the Assassin's Creed franchise doesn't have functioning doors you can interact with. It got me paying closer attention to Final Fantasy as well, and I noticed that while the game does have doors, they have a very simple implementation that some games don't have the luxury of pulling off. You can't dynamically interact with them like they're a regular movable object in the space, although in fairness, that concept sort of just doesn't exist in this game as a whole. Instead, you need to press a button to interact with them, after which a preset animation plays out where you don't control your character. Sometimes it asks you to hold R2 to make you feel like you did something, and then once you're out of that animation, you have control again. That's about it. It is, in a way, a cutscene. The Last of Us 2 couldn't do that. You're supposed to constantly walk in and out of places to look around for supplies, or break the enemy's line of sight with its doors. So it can't constantly take your control away. Doors needed to be easily manipulated by the player in real time. But that meant a heap of animations depending on how you approach the door. Were you walking, sprinting, crouching? Did you immediately go left, right, forwards, backwards? Were you in combat? Because if yes, then it made sense gameplay-wise for the door to close behind you to block off enemies, but any attempts they made at animating that took control away from the player, so they had to settle for an automatic close in combat while it stayed ajar outside of combat. But either way, it also had to be physics-based, so the harder you hit it, the harder it bounced back. Apparently it required a totally different kind of physics object as well, one that could be pushed back but also push you back. It's wholly unique in their engine, not to mention the exact angle you approach from affects how the doorknob grabbing animation plays out. Your companions need to be able to interact with doors too, so do enemies. I mean, I'm giving the Cliff Notes version of the Twitter version, and it's still overwhelming. It even took forever for the sound team to perfect this. And it's not just doors either, there just one of the easier targets. In the devlog for Replace, there's an entry aptly titled The Crate Problem, which discusses how typical 2D platformers have you push crates by moving into them or pressing a button, and then to get around them you could just hop over, but that wasn't enough for the level of immersion this team was going for in their 2.5D game. So the character had to easily be able to pass the object when walking instead of jumping over the crate, but he also needed to be able to grab it from the ends or the side with a button press, and even be able to start beside it and hop onto the crate moving along the Z axis that you can't really see from this perspective. And of course we can probably assume that this applies to other objects in the world as well to a degree. It affects the lighting, it requires exact animation sets for different scenarios, and most people who play it won't bat an eye. I think it's easy to get caught up in the superfluous aspects of game design. Our attention is always drawn to the biggest, most important mechanics or the most insane set pieces. And of course it is, these things are made to stand out, but it's often the simple things that have the most care and effort put into them. It's sometimes the games with no people that tell some of the most interesting stories, and the ones that feature the least demanding gameplay that target emotions that everything else we play can't really. It's incredible to see how developers can take the most unremarkable things and use them for creative expression, and it makes me appreciate just how much work goes into every aspect of creating games. I hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks to Madison and Tim for answering my boneheaded questions with real, insightful answers. If you're new here, consider subscribing and joining the Discord, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.